My name is Sam Gray. I'm a political scientist in training. I'm just about to finish a PhD in political science at the University of Victoria. That's in British Columbia. My field's relevant to this conversation. I study settler colonialism. Particularly, I study it in British settler colonial states, persistent settler colonial states, so Canada, America, New Zealand, and Australia. And I look at reconciliation as the new mode of, the new phase of colonial, the way we're grappling with the past. Reconciliation seems to be the way we're going to go forward with that from the state perspective. When I give a public lecture or when I talk to undergraduate students, I usually say we've got two varieties of colonialism. Colonialism is imperial expansion. We talk about two basic kinds. We talk about colonialism proper, or resource extraction colonialism, when we talk about settler colonialism. So colonialism proper, I like to characterize as, we've come to take your stuff back to our home. Settler colonialism is, we've come to take your home. So settlers come to stay. Settlers have a fervent desire to not talk about settler colonialism. So that's why when we talk about Dakota issues in the state of Minnesota, it's always 1862. So even today, if I go to Brown County and look at their exhibit that they put together for 2012, hell of an impressive exhibit. Stuff there that I've never seen anywhere else and I don't think anybody else has. Doesn't start with treaties. It kind of starts in 1862. And it ends in 1863 in dealing with the war. And then we'll talk about how the war is remembered. But it's always about the war, is my point. It's never about treaty. It's never about the Dakota prior to us getting here and setting the terms of the relationship from the start. And it's certainly not about the Dakota today. When I put all the interviews together, there's a pretty regular roster of things that I encounter. So ideas that come to the fore, concepts that people use. And one of them is definitely presentism. Not everyone calls it presentism. Certainly when I talk to academics, they call it presentism a lot. But the idea that we cannot judge the past, different moral values obtained, and we can't commit what philosophers call the historian's fallacy, which is looking in hindsight as if everyone there thinks as we do and has the benefit of the intervening history to weigh action. But what they mean when they say presentism is that things were right in the past that are wrong now, which is just really self-evidently not the case. So when we talk about things like slavery, we don't ever make the claim that it was right to own people. We might make the claim that it was legal to own people, but you're not going to find a lot of people that say that it was right. We have a deteriorating treaty relationship with Indigenous nations. So at one time, they were seen as nations. They were valued as allies. They were partners in opening up the interior in our terms, in the fur trade. They had merit, they had independent standing, they were sovereign, and then that changes. So that's not presentism. That's a degrading relationship. That's a relationship that's eroding, being eroded by one side. So that change in status indicates that it was never morally okay, that it was never, we decided at some point that they were less useful to us, so they were a little less human in the process. Their humanity goes down several notches. And I think the other excellent argument against presentism is the existence of even a single sort of conscientious objector would seem to argue pretty strongly. And we have a lot of those. We have a lot of people, you have them in the film saying, look, this is just wrong. So unless those are time travelers, the presentism argument doesn't hold. Those people are of their time, and they perceive it as wrong. Another one that I hear a lot is the pendulum has swung too far the other way. So it's now a Dakota dominant narrative. And there's a real fear that, and I mean a genuine fear, I don't want to downplay this at all. What I hear is a concern that the fact that settlers lost their lives is receding into the background, that nobody cares. I had one academic say that when he teaches this, he is shocked at how little concern there is for the hundreds of settler lives that were lost on the frontier. And and he would be one of the people that used the pendulum analogy. The Dakota are finally being allowed to articulate both their history, their own history, and their experience of that history, and their experience of the continuity of that history. So their lived reality, they're finally getting to articulate that. And it's being seen as overshouting the settlers, speaking over them, forcing them into the back. And it's not. The Dakota aren't suppressing the settler narrative, nor is anybody that's listening to the Dakota not listening to the settlers. It's not a zero-sum game. A particular school of thought would say, and I think there's a lot of traction here, that understanding a past that includes a genocide is going to compel certain kinds of action. And it's much easier not to either feel the compulsion to action or to actually take action. So acknowledging that you have a history of genocide, which we've done in Canada. We have state apologies for, now mind you, we've called it ethnocide, and I object to that distinction as well. We've called the residential schools ethnocide. Once you do that, you are committed to a plan of action. Because you cannot say, that was genocide. It's just, there's a moral failing there. And we have to think of ourselves as moral people. I constantly tell students, nobody ever did something just because they could. You'll find history is filled with people with the power to just enact their will, nevertheless making ethical justifications. We have a need to be ethical. We have a need to be moral. Perfectly understandable. Nobody wants to descend from the architects of genocide or participants in genocide. So it's easy to see why there would be a strong appeal to saying that wasn't genocide. It underwrites a lot. It also feeds perfectly into the idea that one of the other tropes that comes out a lot is this weird statute of limitations. Get over it. It was 150 years ago, which seems remarkably easy to say from the position of people who did get over it because they got everything. I reject the distinction between ethnocide and genocide. I think it's a distinction of convenience. So I'm not sure how you talk about killing a culture, but then try and say that that's better than killing a people. It seems to ignore the fact that there are two, particularly from an Indigenous perspective, there are two fairly equal ways to die. You can physically cease to be, or you can stop being you. Those are pretty equivalent. And Indigenous resistance has been predicated for hundreds of years on the fact that there's no difference between the two. So a certain amount of the time they were fighting not being physically killed. Absolutely all of the time they were fighting to continue being Indigenous, to continue being Dakota. That should tell us something. That's important. But in terms of definitions of genocide, it absolutely satisfies Raphael Lemkin's definition. Who's the guy who came up with the term genocide? Lemkin said that there is physical killing, but there's also the extension of the oppressor's culture onto the oppressed qualifies as a stage of genocide. So he includes assimilation as genocide. So I think Lemkin's definition is salient. I also think it's important to look at the way that Lemkin's definition both inspired the United Nations Convention, the Genocide Convention, and then got perverted in the course of drafting that convention. I think it's relevant that ethnocide came out of the definition at the behest of particular states, including yours and mine. And these were states that had Indigenous peoples within their borders and who knew that their actions qualified under that definition. So ethnocide came out. That's relevant. But the definition of genocide still includes things that our state unquestionably engages in, and your state does too. Removal of children. So boarding schools, and the fact that Indigenous children are still hundreds of times more likely to be in state custody than their non-Indigenous peers. The forced sterilization of Indigenous women that occurred in your country and in mine. The United States government has admitted to the coercive sterilization of Indigenous people in the 1970s. Thousands and thousands of them. That qualifies as genocide under the convention. The other definition that I think is important that never ever gets looked at is that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, in its draft form, had a definition of genocide that included what we now separate out as ethnocide. And again, certain states opposed it, including yours and mine. And even when that definition came out, those same states refused to sign the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People anyway. So fought that that conversation happened in the state's wheelhouse and then refused to endorse the document when it was done anyway. We have subsequently signed it, but both your nation and mine said, we're going to sign it, but it doesn't really mean anything. It's kind of a paper tiger. It's got no accountability. There's no enforcement mechanism, all kinds of caveats. So the international indigenous definition of genocide includes assimilation and ethnocide. The original United Nations Convention Declaration was going to include it, and Raphael Lemkin's definition still does include it. But that's one of the nifty things that making the relationship between the United States and Dakota people about 1862 does. So we're not talking about residential schools. We're not talking about the coercive sterilization of Indigenous women. So conveniently, those things come off the menu. As a political scientist, I'm really concerned with that move. That's a nifty rhetorical move. It's dripping with power. So I reject that. I've been told that the state of Minnesota will never apologize to the Dakota ever because there's a fear that that carries legal implications. That what you apologize for, you are responsible for. What you are responsible for, you might have to pay for. The argument becomes a legal argument instead of a moral one, as if we're incapable of the latter kind of reasoning or we shouldn't engage in it. So I hear claims like, when we're talking about the Dakota items that historical societies hold, I'll ask questions like, how do you feel about the fact that you hold these items? And I'll get told that they gave back everything they were supposed to under NAGPRA, under the Native American Graves and Remains Appropriation. They gave everything back that they were supposed to, and I wasn't really asking that. Like, I wasn't asking if the law had been satisfied. I was asking whether we needed to go beyond the law. I mean, the law has always been a minimum standard of stuff we shouldn't do to each other in order for there to not be chaos. But it's never been a moral standard. And the law changes last, right? That's why slavery was outlawed when it was. That's why women got the vote when they did. The law changes last. So to constantly appeal to what the state can do, what it's empowered to do, is devolving to a legal precedent type of argument. There's a great deal of confusion in Canada and in the United States. I haven't studied it in Australia or New Zealand, but there's a huge amount of confusion about what Indigenous nations are. So the default position is that they're ethnic minorities. They're not ethnic minorities. They are not people in need of having their civil rights recognized. They are not people for whom the civil rights movement solved their problems. What making them into ethnic minorities or special interest rights-bearing groups does is remove their sovereignty. And their sovereignty has always been the relevant issue. Treaties were signed with them because they were nations. And that needs to come back on the table. That realization needs to happen. And I'll run into a number of activists for whom Indigenous rights are an odd subset of minority rights. They're special minority rights. So it would help if we were aware of that to begin with. So educating ourselves is something that has to happen, and it's a constant, ongoing, evolving task. I think things like you're doing with the film, taking another look at history, help a lot in dealing with some of the fantastic myth-making that colonialism also engages in. And that's part of Indigenous erasure is telling a different story. And usually it's a story of Indigenous fault, of Indigenous people being particularly ill-suited to modernity. They kind of lost the civilizational race. So that's where we get the vanishing Indian motif. But another powerful colonial myth is the benevolent paternalism. You know, we are acting in their best interests. We know better. And historians do it all the time. I don't know how many people have told me flat out that the Dakota don't know their history, so. They don't get any rights from the American government. That's another massive confusion. The rights they have are inherent. America can recognize them or trample on them, but they don't give them those rights. That's a significant misunderstanding that pitches the conversation in an entirely different direction. The state is the guarantor of rights. The state doesn't give them to you. That's why we call them human rights. The state is meant to recognize and protect those rights. It doesn't give them to you, and you don't have them unless it does. Democracy abhors the idea of extra rights. Everyone's supposed to be the same. Nobody's actually the same in practice, but we do stick really closely to the idea that everyone has the same rights, identical rights, person to person to person. That's why I worry about the claim to balance, because it's being presented as a democratic virtue, right? That everyone's entitled to their opinion, there are two sides to every story. We've got a number of phrases and platitudes that speak to that idea, that all totally ignore history and power. And if you're going to ignore history and power in that way, then that's a fairly strong exercise of power. If you're going to say the Dakota should probably shut up now because they've had the stage long enough, in the name of balance. So I have been told that every display that deals with the war should be 50% Dakota, mathematically, 50% settler. That's balance. It doesn't matter that the Dakota never made it into the archive to begin with, and the archive is still our go-to. Everything we get from the archive. That we denigrate oral history as if it's fanciful story making around the fire at night. That the Dakota story still hasn't been told. It should be 50% settler, 50% Dakota. And if it's not, it's unbalanced. The discussion over the concentration camp, there's a lot more gray area because we don't have an international legal definition of concentration camp. We do have a generally accepted definition of concentration camp that it completely satisfies. And again, I think it's important that the Dakota people experienced it as a concentration camp. Whether or not, I've heard a lot of disagreement over whether the intention behind it is to function as a concentration camp or if it in fact functioned as a concentration camp from the white perspective. I think it did both. Then in addition to that, the Dakota experienced it as a concentration camp. Political scientists are not going to have a problem calling that a concentration camp at all. And I think there's a reason why Fort Snelling has joined the International Sites of Conscience. And it's not because it wasn't a concentration camp. By saying it's not a concentration camp, you're saying to the Dakota, your experience is invalid and your feelings are wrong. But this always denigrates, it devolves into a fact fight, which the Dakota are never going to win because not coincidentally, we own all the facts. We wrote them down to begin with. And we had a vested interest in those facts being the ones that support our case. You make part of that argument in the film. What goes into the record? The record doesn't just collect everything in the name of posterity. The record is shaped. This is why it confuses me when people start to talk about politicizing something. I'm like, what made you think it was ever not political? Also, what's your definition of politics? I'm getting confused at this point. But when we constantly appeal to the archive, one of the things we do is erase the Dakota from the story. We then write them in as like a cardboard cutout that we can place in the scene at will. How they experienced their history, how they remember their history, and how they feel about the relationship past and present is wildly relevant. And to claim that we don't find that in Sibley's letters is absurd. It's irrelevant at best, and it's damned oppressive at worst. But that mucks with the narrative of balance, because one of the other things that's important in the narrative of balance is equal blame. That's what we're really talking about when we talk about balance. And even presenting this as part of I got a fellowship at the Center for Studies in Religion and Society, because if you're going to talk about Indigenous politics, you're probably going to get put at some place like the Center for Studies in Religion and Society. So if I did a presentation on the Dakota War and learned quickly that I had to not use any statistical information, because the second that I said that 20-odd Dakota died and somewhere between 400 and 700 settlers died, I lost the entire audience. And I would hear people, this is in Victoria, BC. People would say, well, you can't really argue with those figures. And I kept thinking, well, I can, and I will, and I do. The figures are the start of the knowledge about that period, not the end. Why are people tuning out? The settler deaths on the frontier are horrific. They are horrific, and they should not be forgotten. But they are not the beginning, middle, and end of the story. And they have been for 150 years. The other thing I get from settler interviewees quite broadly is that intergenerational trauma isn't a thing, which is a worrisome claim for a number of reasons. First and foremost, because it tends to segue into a conversation about how there's just something wrong with the Dakota or Indigenous people generally. Like I said, they're not built for modernity. It's a shame, but there's something inherently deficient. And there's a kind of category error going on where they're trying to blame that inability to keep up, to participate in the modern project and get with the program. They're trying to blame that on history, and that's a faulty kind of a reasoning. So there's no acknowledgement of intergenerational trauma on the part of the Dakota. But I've asked settlers, because another trope I hear is, what about the settler genocide? Which again, that's a definitional problem, but it's a strong appeal to balance. I've heard genocide cuts both ways. It's an odd claim. It took a while to parse when I got home from that interview. But I see what they're saying. They're saying, what about the settler dead? I get that, but there's a lot of work you're going to have to do argumentatively between what about the settler dead and what about the settler genocide that you're not actually going to be able to do successfully. It's a neat podium move. It's a neat thing you can shout from a soapbox, but it's not a great thing to have to argue, because you're going to get in quicksand real fast. But I've asked them, if there's a settler genocide, why don't you experience that trauma now? Like, why we know from groups that have been through genocide that there's an intergenerational effect. We've got a number of fairly robust studies that have been done on the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of people that have undergone profound historical trauma. And their answer to me is, well, we're doing real well. Things worked out. I'm like, exactly, things worked out. That says something, or it should. I'm always waiting for the and. Like there should be steps beyond that tell you something about that contentious history. So in terms of not being able to reconcile, the settler side really should be able to. I haven't seen any Dakota claims, even from militant Dakota, and again, I'm really uncertain about the use of that word, but I hear it a lot. So even from the most extreme Dakota, I have heard no claim that involves settlers giving up anything personal. Anything. So they're not coming for the farm. And with nothing at stake, I would think settlers would be willing to engage in it. So when I hear the denigration of land return as a strategy, that just strikes me as really strange. The Indigenous conversation is almost always about land, and there's a reason for that. And it's not a property conversation. This is a being conversation. This is an existence, this is an existential conversation. Because there isn't really a way to be Indigenous without that connection. So we have a lot of work on urban indigeneity, what that means, what that does to identity, to be off of your land and to be removed from land generally. But for the most part, indigeneity is about territory, is about your homeland. And the Dakota still cannot access many, if not most, of their spiritual sites. How do you be Dakota in that case? Where's the access to cold water? Where's the access to Bedote? Why do they have to pay the park fee? I would think they paid the park fee and then some, historically. But they cannot access a significant number of their sacred sites, in which case, again, how do you be Dakota? Of course, the immediate stumbling block there is it's illegal. You can't be Dakota in Minnesota. That law's still on the books. How do you not rescind that legislation? It's not de jure binding anyway. Like, you're not out arresting the Dakota for living here. So it doesn't hold any legal water anyway. It's incredibly offensive and still on the books. And again, I've been told that it will not be rescinded because there's an intonation there of wrongdoing that they're worried is legally actionable, that will lead to reparations claims. So reconciliation is ostensibly meant to address the entire relationship. But in making it about 1862, lots of really interesting things happen. For one, the Dakota become aggressors. We don't see that anywhere else when we're talking about Indigenous reconciliation. There's no settler victimhood story elsewhere. So making it about 1862 allows the Dakota to be painted as the architects of their own demise. Settler interviewees won't use the word reconciliation because it has overtones of settler wrongdoing. So, they find it to be too loaded a word, that they are cautioned by people they know that no apology is owed, there's no complicity or wrong that was done. I know I had an interviewee not want to participate because I use the term historical injustice. So we dispute the term reconciliation because, and I've heard this from Dakota people here as well, what's the re about? Were we ever reconciled and I missed that? Like, was that a point in history where there was a magnificent we and then it all went to hell? So the concentration on the re is making a very valid point. So maybe instead of reconciliation and bridging, we might want to talk about an entirely new relationship. We might want to talk about if there should be a we, if there was a we, what would a good we look like? How would a good we operate? And there are precedents that have to be set before that happens. So non-harm would be good. An acknowledgement of sovereignty is essential. Basically, in Canada, we're now talking about the resurrection of a treaty relationship. Whether it's under treaty or in the spirit of treaty varies from place to place and time to time. But that treaty relationship meant something. That meant we came together and acknowledged one another's sovereignty. That's an important place to start. If you can define something out of existence, it's a way of not solving but dissolving a problem, if that makes sense. So it's a way of saying, this isn't really an issue, so we probably don't have to talk about it. In fact, it's fantastic for that. It works like that. It works like gangbusters for that. It's amazing. The state does it all the time. From a settler perspective, the battle over definition looks more like who gets to say what happened? In which case, in both cases, actually, it's a fairly raw exercise of power. It gets masked in all those democratic virtues that I'm really interested in, like balance, objectivity, neutrality, meritocracy, that everyone is born a clean slate, you don't inherit the sins of your ancestors, which always intrigued me as a myth because we're pretty down with inheriting all the benefits, but we're really not okay with inheriting anything bad. All that stuff goes away. You're born without that. But you are born with the land, the name, the legacy. The power to define is a foundational power. And that's why you see it being wielded like a heavy stick. People are never not aware that that's a foundational power. And it is hoarded. I mean, in certain political science definitions, the state is actually the original definer. In Hobbes, the state is the original. The state is the person the entity that provides the encyclopedia. The state says what is. The state is the original definer. That's how power comes up in that treatise, in Leviathan. The state sets definitions. And whenever you're wading into that, be very conscious of it. And that's part of the conversation on genocide. All the hot button terms: genocide, concentration camp, forced march, bounties, they're all disputed. It doesn't matter how many times you dredge up that Winona Daily Republican bounty notice, you'll still get people telling you there weren't bounties. It doesn't matter how many times you produce the check they wrote to Nathan Lamson for Little Crow, there were no bounties. I've asked settler interviewees who are either historians that are not part of that group, or who are journalists, or who are, people like yourself that are positioned peripheral to but interacting with the historians. What's with the truculence? And I get a range of reactions. I get a range of answers, and one of them is that people are protecting their expertise. They have this piece of knowledge that they hold. In some cases that they hold exclusively in terms of the archive. They've accessed this information. So there's some reputational shoring up that's going on. But this isn't a zero-sum game of history where either we're listening to the Dakota or we're listening to the settlers. It doesn't play out that way. It costs us nothing to listen to the Dakota. We're not listening to someone else. Like I said, our capacity for stories is infinite. Otherwise, we would shutter all the bookstores. We're never going to have heard enough Dakota oral history, and the urge to instantly start nitpicking it, or either denigrating oral history itself as being inferior to written history, or imperfect, subjective, transmitted orally, and therefore deformable. Ignores, first of all, the ways that our history is too. The way that, for example, in a court of law, we know damn well that eyewitness testimony is anything but infallible, whether you write it down right away or not, that the brain doesn't work like a camera, and it never, ever did. So it ignores the way history actually is experienced and recorded by everyone who records it. But then it goes on to do a lot of other political work in perpetuating that epistemic violence and doing violence to people's ways of knowing. That's important. That alone is a reason not to do it. We can, and lots of historians do, engage in a kind of a triangulation where we take everything we know from everywhere that anyone knows it, anyone that holds an understanding, and kind of figure out what we can interpolate from there. That's probably a healthy way to do it. It's a good way to start anyway. Any way that isn't saying, we don't find that in the written record, shut up. Or all of the times that I hear that Dakota don't know their own history. So whenever we're aware that we're participating in a colonial conversation is probably the time to disrupt that conversation a little. And be less concerned with being capital R right. Because we are really concerned with being capital R right. And that, again, does more political work than it provides illumination. And we should all be concerned with arriving at better understandings, not greater expertise.